Host of Design Matters, the world's first podcast about design, which has garnered millions of downloads and a Cooper Hewitt National Design Award. I'd like to introduce to you and bring to the stage Ms. Debbie Millman.
I think that's my talk. I'm a terrible collaborator. While they're getting the right one up, I should probably warn you that my talk is practically the antithesis to this talk that you've just heard from Michael. Everything that Michael asked you to do, I didn't do. So in many ways, it's a good sort of back-to-back because it's I think, a wonderful way of looking at what happens when you don't follow your dreams and when you don't have any sense of what your own personal authenticity is and when you are definitely not bold. So let's see if we get the correct presentation up. My presentation is called On Rejection: How the worst moments of your life could actually turn out to be your best. And the original title was called On Failure. And I changed it when I realized that rejection is, in a lot of ways, worse than failure. Failure is something you decide. You decide when you're failing. You fail when you stop trying. When you're rejected, it's other people telling you to stop trying. And in a lot of ways, I think that that's worse. But we'll see. We'll see what happens. And we're still working on the presentation. I'm going to go like that just to see. No? So how y'all doing? Worst comes to worst, I can get Michael back up on the stage. We could do a live episode of Design Matters, which would probably be a lot more interesting and a lot more fun. Nobody's going to tell me how they are. Anybody have any early questions? Anybody have any questions they want to ask before I get started?
Who's the favorite person you interviewed?
Michael Beirut. No, actually, my Design Matters interview with Michael is not my favorite. One of my favorite interviews of all time is with Michael, but it's from my book, How to Think Like a Great Graphic Designer. So it's a really interesting story. I had started the book thinking that I was going to email my interviews to people. And I was doing this book in 2000. I was writing it in 2006. I had just started doing Design Matters, hadn't really at all gotten my sort of sea legs with interviewing yet. And when I started to work on How to Think Like a Great Graphic Designer, which is sort of an antithesis to what the title is standing for, or what it states, how to think like a great graphic designer, it's actually the opposite. It's how great graphic designers think, how different great graphic designers think differently. And so initially I thought I'd make it easy on myself and I would send out questionnaires to the different people that I was interviewing and hope that they would respond with really scintillating, insightful, illuminating answers. And I got Michael's responses back to my questions, which were things like, early on in my interviewing, I used to ask people what was their first creative memory. Michael's response was, I don't remember. What is your favorite typeface? Oh, okay, good. They're telling me to move on. I guess this isn't as interesting a story, but I'm going to finish it anyway. And Michael responds with things like, I don't know, I don't have one. And I thought, I can't print this. It's really terrible. But I also can't not include Michael Beirut in a book that's called How to Think Like a Great Graphic Designer. And oh my God, he's like the best thinker of all. So I asked him if we could redo it and if we can do it face to face. And we did, and we met, and we both had the same memories, and that means it's fairly accurate, of meeting at the Mayros one wintry morning very early and having this extraordinary conversation, which turned out to be one of the great interviews I think I've ever conducted. And we talked quite at length and quite earnestly and quite entertainingly about Michael's love of laundry. So I do encourage, the book is available online. You can get it free everywhere. It's BitTorrenting everywhere. You can just get it and read it, and you don't have to pay for it, and really, really, really enjoy it. So anyway, here I am to talk about rejection. So if you have listened to my podcast, Design Matters, you probably have heard me talk to any designer that I can possibly talk to about what their trajectory is over the arc of their life. How did they become who they've become? What were the decisions that they made that led them to being who they are today? And so when I'm not doing Design Matters and I meet people that I haven't met before, especially young people, I like to ask them what they want to be when they grow up. It's a question that I tend to ask anybody that's sort of 18 and below. I'm going to hear sort of very interesting things, all kinds of different careers. But I heard an answer to the question about, I don't want to say that, 2 years ago at this point, which was the best answer to the question, what do you want to be when you grow up, that I've ever heard. It was a young woman. I asked her, what do you want to be when you grow up? And she looked at me without blinking an eye, and she said, everything. And I think there's something incredibly heroic about the notion of feeling when you're at the beginning of your life, the beginning of your career, the beginning of your being a person, or that you could have or do anything. I did not have that. I did not have that at all. I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do, what I wanted to be, and how to go about getting anything that I wanted. Very early on in my life, I thought maybe I would be an actress or a dancer. This is me as Queen Esther in our synagogue's annual Purim parade. I won my very first prize in this costume, which my mother handmade. This is an illustration that I found. My mom recently did what a lot of good old Jews do. They moved from New York to Florida. And in doing so, she substantially downsized and literally gave me back boxes of things that she had found and kept from my childhood. And so she gave it to me back, and I went through everything really gingerly, really excitedly. What was I going to find? And I found book reports and report cards and this drawing. And when I came across this drawing, I looked at it, and I immediately felt that somehow, at 8 years old, when I did this drawing, that I was predicting my life. So I want to deconstruct the drawing for you a little bit. So it's the streets of New York City. I'm a native New Yorker, but I was born in Brooklyn, and then we moved to Queens, and then Staten Island. Then my parents got divorced, and I moved to Long Island. My dad moved to Manhattan, so I'd have this sort of interesting commute back and forth on the weekends. Didn't move to Manhattan proper until 1983 after I graduated college. It was the big dream, living in Manhattan. 8 years old, not so sure I realized it then, but there I am walking with my mom. My mom is wearing the very popular at that time outfit that Barbie wore, Tangerine Dream. And then you see the usual city sights, a bus, a cab, a delivery truck. But what really stopped me in my tracks, which really sort of caught my breath and still does every single time I look at this drawing, was the fact that somehow on the delivery truck, I drew the Lay's potato chips logo. I drew it. I drew it from memory. It was that embedded in my psyche already. And in many ways, I have not changed, aside from having but not wearing an outfit that looks an awful lot like Tangerine Dream in my closet. I spend most of my life thinking about and drawing logos. But at the time, I did not know that that was even a career. I went to SUNY Albany, and seems to be a little bit of stickiness with this remote. And I could look at this drawing for the rest of my life, but I have a feeling you might get a little bored. So let's see if I move around and go like that. No? Oh, there we go. Yes. So I went to SUNY Albany. My only criteria for going to the State University of New York at Albany was that my best friend Tammy went. That was it. I had absolutely no idea where to go. My parents were very specific about the fact that I had to go to a state school. It was the only thing we could all afford. And I ended up with a major in English and a minor in Russian literature. So I now, not quite so jokingly, say that I have a degree in reading, because that's all I did when I was in school. I read. I had absolutely no idea what I wanted to do. There was one thing that had captivated me when I was in college, and that was the student newspaper. SUNY Albany had one of the best student newspapers in the country. But that was coincidental. When I got there, I realized it. I didn't know it beforehand. And when I saw it, and I saw what the students were doing and writing about culture and art and music and politics, I was enthralled. And I thought maybe I would want to do something like that. So I went up to the student newspaper my first semester of college and was instantly rejected. I didn't have any examples that I could show them, and I didn't go back and try again until my first semester junior year, second semester junior year, wherein I went back in and they had an emergency. There was a feminist uprising outside the health food store on campus, and they needed somebody to cover it immediately, and I took the gauntlet. So by the time I finished my college experience, I had become the arts and features editor of the newspaper. And this was my swan song. My last issue of the paper as editor-in-chief was doing an homage, a celebration of sorts to James Joyce and Bloomsday and Ulysses. And I had taken out an entire semester studying Ulysses, one of the greatest books ever read, ever written, and ever read. And had come across this line, which really moved me. The longest way round is the shortest way home. And I didn't quite know why it moved me so much, but I decided, I could do whatever I wanted. I was the editor-in-chief, and I made it the headline. I very quickly realized doing the school newspaper, that I was much, much, much more interested in how things looked than what they read. And so I'd allow the writers to write these rambling long pieces only because it would give me more pages to design. And that was my first education and my first experience as a designer. And thought maybe I could do something like this for a living. So this is me in 1983. Dig the hair. Dig that hair. Dig that collar. Aunt Ida made that for me. I had to wear it on graduation. So this was my homemade resume using all of the skills that I had mastered in school. And so here you can see my unique combination of peño and souvenir, highly, highly effective. If you look a little bit closer, it tells you a bit about some of my very special skills. So you can see here my technical skills included the operation of the CompuGraphic computer photography typesetting equipment, the MDT 350 terminal, the Trendsetter 88 typesetter, the 7200 ITG headliner, and the Agfa Gevert vertical camera. I knew how to make stats. I had mad skills in the stat room. But these were my only skills. I had no other skills. I had Russian literature, I knew everything that Dostoevsky and Tolstoy had ever written. Gogol, Lermontov, you name it, I read it. But those aren't the real things that get you jobs. So I went out and I tried to find a job, and it was very, very difficult for me. The thing that I really wanted to do was to work at Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair, the year before, had just been rebooted, and Leo Lehrman had taken over as editor, and it was very much a literary arts magazine, and I was madly in love with it. I read it cover to cover every month. There was nothing more than I wanted to go and work for Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair is and was owned by Condé Nast. And so the way that things worked back in the sort of Jurassic Age, as Michael mentioned before, was that if you were interested in working at a place, you dropped your portfolio off. And I had a faux leather brown portfolio sort of banged against my legs as I was walking, plastic flappy pages inside, holding preciously all my clips from the newspaper days. And I dropped it off at Condé Nast. Miraculously, I got a call back, and if you got a call back, that meant you might meet one of the art directors or creative directors. And Charles Churchward was the creative director at Vanity Fair. And I had these fantasies of being his Rosalind Russell with a pencil behind my ear, click-clacking through the Condé Nast newsroom. and helping him. Instead, I ended up meeting with a woman from HR. She was very glamorous, sort of the Condé Nast look that you might have witnessed in The Devil Wears Prada. She was wearing a shift, a sleeveless shift. I remember this like it was yesterday. Really, really thin arms. She had a chignon on top of her head. And she looked at me and she said, "So, what would you like to do in graphic design?" And I didn't know that there were different things you could do. I didn't know there were different disciplines within design. And I looked at her very earnestly and said what was in my head, which was, I'd do anything. That really wasn't what she was hoping to hear. I think she was hoping to hear more like, I really have a specialty in editorial design or promotional design or any number of different types of design of which I knew nothing. And so sadly, I did not get the job. I was rejected. A bunch of my friends that had worked at the school newspaper had gotten jobs at a little fledgling rock and roll magazine called Rockville. This was a magazine that was given out at rock and roll venues in the same way that playbills are given out at theaters. And they had all gotten jobs and they needed somebody to come in and do paste up and layout. And so I got my job working $6 an hour doing really, really old school drafting. I was amazing with a rapidograph and Rubylith and just loved doing it. And while I was doing it, I also got an opportunity to interview some rock and rollers and thought, this could be a really interesting career. Why don't I go back to school and really learn what it means to be a journalist? And I thought, right in my backyard, I'm living in Manhattan, I'm living in a 4th floor tenement walk-up. I have to walk through a couple's bedroom to get to mine, which is a little bit difficult because, they had the conjugal visits. And so I thought, you know what, I'm gonna go back to school, I'm gonna really make something of myself. I wanna be a journalist, and I'm gonna go to Columbia University, one of the best journalism schools in the country, right in my backyard. And so I applied. And about 2 or 3 months later, I get the thin envelope. For those of us that have gotten envelopes from universities before, the thin envelopes are the rejection envelopes, and the big fat envelopes are the financial aid forms. And so I was rejected. I was really sad. First of all, my father had gone to Columbia University, and so I felt like I'd let him down. He had gone there, I didn't get in. That meant I was a pale in comparison. And I did then what I usually do. Whenever I get down about something in my life, I turn to art. I make art. And so I did a piece at the time, which I think really represents my sentiments of that moment. Like, please, just anything. I take anything, I do anything, just give me a chance. And there was a little ad that I had seen in the back of like an art forum or some sort of magazine of the time that I used to read, and it was about a contest. And you had to send in slides. And I sent in slides, and I remember I was nearly missing the deadline, so I decided to FedEx my slides. Well, that was a good tactic, because they opened my slides, and lo and behold, I got this opportunity to have a show at Long Island University, the Brooklyn campus of Long Island University, back when Brooklyn was a really, really dangerous place to go. And this is the show that I did. It was 100 small paintings, all word paintings, all telling sort of one cumulative story through individual canvases. And here you can see the linear version. And at the time, I got a couple of good reviews, and I thought, this story would be a lot better if this remote worked. Okay, sorry about that. I thought, maybe I should take this art thing a little bit more seriously. Maybe I should go back to school and learn how to become an artist. And right in my backyard was the Whitney Independent Study Art Program, one of the best programs in the country. So I took all my little slides, all my little clips that I had, some of the good reviews that I'd gotten, and I applied to the Whitney School. And lo and behold, another rejection. This was a really, really difficult time in my life. I was approaching 30. I was not in any kind of good, healthy relationship. I was living in a 4th floor tenement walk-up, and I had to go through another person's bedroom to get to mine. And I really felt like I had no place to go. And so I went back to Rockville. I kept doing the work and doing the layout and the paste up, and hoped that something would come along that would pick me up and transform me into somebody else. And that sort of happened in the form of an annual report. Is there, with the tech guys back there, is there a way that I might be able to get another remote because I'm pressing this like time after time? There we go. It happened in the form of an annual report. I had been working with one of my friends at Rockville. We had our own little company while we were working at Rockville, and we did the piece that I showed you before, Mickey's World Tour, the piece that the remote was stuck on. And it was work that I was doing to make money. It wasn't work that I was doing that had any sense of purpose to it. But I didn't know how to make work with purpose. I didn't even know what work with purpose was. All I knew was that the horizontal and the vertical scaling on Mickey's World Tour was an embarrassment. And I didn't want it in my portfolio, but it was the biggest project that we had ever done. And then this happens. Now, this is something that happened a long time ago, and most people looking at it now, except for a couple of people like Michael Beirut, look at it and think, what's the big whoop? But this was, in 1989, the annual report cover of the merge between Time and Warner. And it was the first time an annual report had a cover that was essentially a metaphor, that was conceptual. And the question was, why? And a company named Frankfurt did this. I didn't know it at the time, but it was a little bit derivative to work that Rick Valicenti was doing at Thirst in Chicago, but I had never seen anything like it before. Computer manipulated images, fluorescent type. In 1989, this was radical. And I saw this work and I thought, how am I ever going to get an opportunity to make work that looks like this? And I looked at my pitiful faux leather portfolio with the flappy pages and the vertical scaling, and I wanted to kill myself. Through a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend's brother's lawyer, and I'm really not joking about that little trajectory there, I met Steve Frankfurt of Frankfurt Balkind's brother. Steve's brother Michael introduced me to Steve. Steve was the Frankfurt and Frankfurt Balkind, and upon meeting me, he loved me. He thought I was adorable. And at 32, I was adorable. I'm 54 now, so you have to just take my word for it. At 32 years old, I was adorable. He looked at my portfolio, he thought it was fabulous. He'd have Aubrey Balkind, his partner, look at the portfolio as well. My interview with Aubrey was the opposite of my interview with Steve. Aubrey hated me. Aubrey hated adorable. Aubrey hated faux leather portfolios that had flappy plastic pages. And he looked at my portfolio and he said, Steve really likes you. I don't like your work. We'll hire you, but not as a designer. And I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I needed to be able to learn how to make that kind of work. And that if I didn't work there, I might never, ever learn. And so he said he had a job for an account person. And I said, okay. And I went to work for Aubrey Balkind at Frankfurt Balkind. One bit of advice, first bit of advice for the talk today. Don't ever go to work for somebody that doesn't like you. It never, ever gets better, ever. There's no way if you ever to persuade that person that they were wrong about their first impression. I think that's just general speaking. You can never change a first impression if it's terrible. In any case, I worked there for about a year until I couldn't take it anymore. I left doing this kind of work, started to try to learn how to do this kind of work, watched other people do this kind of work. And then about a year or so later, I couldn't take it anymore. I got headhunted to a company that I went to really because I had no other options and needed to be able to pay my rent. It was a company called Sterling Group at the time. It had just come out of bankruptcy from Michael Peters. And I have actually been there ever since. I've been there for 20 years. It was the first time I went to an organization that made logos, that made packages that were on shelves. And because I had this sort of innate love for this kind of work, I suddenly found a place that I felt I could do something. However, they didn't need a designer. I didn't have a design portfolio that they were even looking for. They weren't looking for an account person. They were looking for a salesperson. I'd gone from being a designer to an account person to a salesperson. I was mortified, but I needed the job, and I thought it would be good to have something that could pay my bills, which it could. Thankfully, after a couple of years, I moved into a different position and then a different position, and about, 10 or 15 years ago, I became president and oversee all of the design. Now, that was wonderful, but it still wasn't the kind of soul-enriching design that I felt I was really looking for, and I really wanted to be part of a community. I wanted to feel like I could be part of like-minded people that were interested in changing the world with graphic design. And frankly, drawing Lay's logos, while really, really interesting, wasn't changing the world. And I didn't know if I'd ever be able to do that while working at Sterling. And so I started looking around elsewhere, not for another place to work, but for another place to contribute. And so I found AIGA. And AIGA had a special interest group called the Center for Brand Experience, and I thought that was right up my alley. And I went and I volunteered and I got on the board and I made cupcakes. We weren't funded by any chapter, so we had to make all our own money to be able to do things. And I was on the board for 3 years, and the terms of being on the board meant that every 3 years you had to either roll off or get voted back on. And at the end of my 3 years, I wanted to continue my role on the board. I loved doing it so much. And I applied to be on the board again, and I got rejected. I was the only person on the board that was kicked off the board. Everybody else on the board stayed on the board except for me. It's really hard to not take that personally. I was really devastated. I couldn't understand. And then somebody said, "We think your work is a little too traditional." I'm like, what does that have to do with making cupcakes? And then the executive director at the time, who's still the executive director, a man named Rick Raffay, I think he'd seen how much enthusiasm and passion I had for this organization, and he asked me to have lunch. And while we had lunch, he said, "Press on. I really do think this organization can benefit from somebody with your talent and your expertise. So I urge you to press on." And I think as somewhat of a consolation prize, he asked me if I wanted to be a juror in the upcoming 365 competition, the annual design competition that AIGA had. In my mind, one of, if not the most prestigious design competition in the universe. And if somebody had said, we'll give you a choice, you could get kicked off this board, but you'll get to be a judge in this competition, I would have in instant picked getting kicked off the board to be a judge. That's how prestigious it felt to me. And so that's what I did. I went and did that. And as part of the credentials that you have to show in the publication, you have to submit some of the work that you've done so that people that are looking at the annual can get an understanding of the work that you've done to get you to that place. And so I included 2 pieces of work: the Burger King logo that I had recently worked on, and some work that we had done for Star Wars Episode 2. Those were the 2 sort of biggest, most glamorous projects I'd worked on up until that time, and I sent them in. So that's what happens. I go and do my judging, and I meet 2 other people that are the jurors on the packaging design competition. One of which is a guy that had just come from Apple, and he was not interested at all in the competition. And then another woman who had a very prestigious small boutique firm. We met. She looked at me. The first thing she said, "There's no way anything from a supermarket or a drugstore is getting into this competition." And I was like, okay. But I didn't mean it. And we spent the entire day arguing over what was good design and what was something that she could and I could agree on that was good packaging design. And out of 200 entries, we could only agree on 7. And I knew that we had really let down the AIGA people who really wanted a slightly more robust section on packaging design in the annual. And so I left there that day feeling like, maybe my thing with AIGA isn't meant to be. Maybe I'm just not the right kind of person for them. They're a lot smarter, they're a lot more precious, they seem to really be much better designers than I am. I think that's going to be that. And that was that. Aren't you glad you waited for that slide? I know the anticipation is just killing you when I can't use this remote, right? There's very little Google, there's no Facebook, no Twitter, nothing like that at all. The main thing that people were doing, the main things that people were doing online at that time were porn, games, the J. Crew catalog. When that came out, everybody was like, oh my God, the world is changing. And email, that was it. That's all people really did. But there was this other thing that was beginning to happen. There was this enterprise that was called blogging, which kind of came from weblog, blogging. I had never heard about blogging, I had never blogged, I had never read anything online about design, and on May 2nd, 2003, my world changed. A friend of mine sent me a link that she wanted me to read, but she wanted me to read it when I was in a good mood and in the privacy of my own home. When it was porn, I had to go right away. And it was this site called Speak Up. And there was an article called AIGA Sold Out. In this article, it talks about how Debbie Millman, your AIGA juror this year, they're referring to letters to the editor that I had written in Graphic Design USA, says she's been in the business 20 years and Graphic Design USA has always been the magazine she turns to for cultural relevance and design intelligence. Perhaps she's lying simply to see her name in print, or maybe she's actually telling the truth. Either way, we're doomed. Year by year, the AIGA gets suckered into deals with these corporate clowns, and it really betrays the trust I have in my profession and you. That hurt. What I didn't realize right away was that the little line underneath that said 83 were comments. And then when I realized it and it clicked in, these are the kinds of things that I saw. These are all comments. Not that I'm a particularly faithful or enthusiastic consumer, but as a designer, I have to point out a lousy makeover when I see one. The flying oval Burger King logo just looks desperate and sad. Same with the Midas and Pringles logos. I do not do those. They all spin indiscriminately from the witless school of logo design. And then another comment. You see an establishment of growing corporate poison. This poison, represented here by she-devil Debbie Millman, is conspiring with AIGA to permeate the integrity of our precious design world, killing any possibility of a talented, anti-establishment lone wolf like yourself from ever succeeding and getting recognized. Boy, this was from Armin Witt, the proprietor of Speak Up. Boy, talk about a pair of turds that got sidetracked. Those two packages, although they serve the need or whatever bullshit explanation anyone wants to throw, should not be included in what is supposed to be the graphic design publication of America. This was from John Bielenberg. This probably hurt as much as the She-Devil one. I happened to be judging the AIGA competition the same day as Debbie Millman. I may be mistaken, but I think she was filling in for someone who couldn't make it that day. People like Felix won't support an organization that validates someone like Debbie Millman, let alone join together to support a cause. And then finally, but trust me, there's no hidden agenda to change the integrity of the organization or look the other way when someone like Millman takes advantage of their involvement. In that case, is AIGA really to blame? So basically, I was being blamed for everything. The people at AIGA hated me, the people that were anti-AIGA people hated me. I felt like the most hated person in the design community, and honestly, on May 2nd, 2003, I really thought my career was over. It sounds funny now, but at the time I was humiliated. I was humiliated for myself, I was humiliated for Sterling. I didn't want them to find out that I had been talked about this way. I thought that I was letting the company down, letting all my employees down, letting my family down. I I felt shamed. I felt shameful. I felt awful. And I remember walking home that night crying, thinking, I don't know what to do. Maybe I have to quit. I have to do something else. And it was a really, really tough time for me. And I was rejected there too. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do. And I did something that was, maybe you can see it. I'm embarrassed, it's shameful, actually, that I did this. Book. This is being a cool girl. This is not what I felt at all. I felt like I had no other choice. I had to do something that showed that I didn't care, but I knew what you were saying anyway. And then I ended up having this really intense back and forth with the folks at Speak Up and tried to tell them why I felt that the logo that we had done for Burger King was successful. It was tested, people loved it all over the world. Who would they decide to say that it wasn't something that was worthy? And then ultimately, the last comment on that thread was Dave Weinberg, a guy that worked at Landor, who came in to support me, and we've been friends ever since. Now, what happened after this was interesting. They didn't stop writing about me. And I was really, really upset about this. I would go every single day to this site, and there was always some disparaging comment about me. This was an article called, "Is the Dark Side Prevailing?" And the first sentence is, "The recent discussion about Debbie Millman has yielded some very thought-provoking issues. It's also bummed me out." I'm like, honey, you don't know anything about being bummed out. Nothing. At that point, I went to my IT guy, I'm like, you have to be able to take this site off. I can't, make it not allowable, because I was obsessed. I'd been refreshing all day, waiting for something mean to be said about me. And so then that was that. That was it. He cut me off. And I stopped reading it. And I thought that was really bad. But then really, really strange things started to happen. And in many ways, they haven't stopped. Armin Vick, the proprietor of this website, he's 23 years old at the time. He's this little snot-nosed whippersnapper. He knows I say that about him. He writes me. He writes me an email. And he apologizes. He apologizes. Now, he doesn't apologize for calling my work a pair of turds. He makes that clear. He still thinks that they're a pair of turds. But he apologizes for the bullying that ensued and how unprofessional he felt that ultimately was. And because I was so really interested in what they were doing, and the whole notion of writing about design in real time was fascinating to me, I told him that. I said, well, thank you for apologizing. Keep doing what you're doing. It's a really, really interesting thing that you're doing. And I think there's a lot of potential there. He then turned around and asked me if I'd be interested in writing for Speak Up. And I did. And I started. My first piece was aptly called Design Regrets. And suddenly I was part of this community. I was part of this community that I had never expected to be a part of. And I found this camaraderie and this sense of belonging that I had never experienced. And we decided that we were going to really celebrate what we were doing. Armin created a book called Speak Up, a little brochure. We decided that we were all going to go to the upcoming AIGA conference in Vancouver that year in 2003. We were going to distribute it renegade style, leave it in bathrooms, leave it on chairs. We wanted to rile people up. We wanted to piss people off. And what was really interesting is that while we were doing all of those things, we were also all falling madly in love with each other and madly in love with the possibility of trying to communicate in real time about design. We all went to Vancouver together, and just very coincidentally, I end up on an airplane going to Vancouver and seated next to a very lovely woman who, when I'm seated there, and if I had more time, I'd give you all the details about this story because it's one of the greatest stories I have. But I sit next to this woman, and I see that she's reading a magazine, and all of a sudden she goes, "Paula!" And I'm like, oh, Paula, there's only one Paula in the design business. It's Paula Scher. And she's waving, and she's waving back, and I'm like, And so I start talking to her. She's going to the conference, and she tells me that she works at Print Magazine, and she asks me why I'm going to the conference, and I tell her why I'm going to the conference, and we're having this speak up thing, and we're having this party, and she should come, and she gives me her card, and I put it in my bag without looking at it, and she said, send me the information, and when I get back to my hotel, when I get to my hotel room, I pick out the card, and I send her the information, and that was her card. She was the editor-in-chief of Print Magazine. And she came to our event, and she, I think as well, thought there was something really interesting about this blogging thing. The very next year, I get an invitation, an email from Joyce. She's putting together a little competition at the upcoming How Conference. I don't know if you remember a show at the time, I think it might even still be on, it's called Iron Chef. This was really before the sort of reality TV phenomenon that we now know today, but it was about people making food in real time. She wanted to do something with designers called Ironic Chef. And she asked me if I wanted to be one of the designers on the stage. This to me was the definition of hell. But I thought if I would say no to her, that she might never ask me to do another thing again. So I said yes, I would do it. And I didn't find out until I got to San Diego, where the conference was, that as the ironic chefs, we would have to actually wear chef's outfits. Yeah, that's me and Alex Isley and Mick Hodgson. And so we did that all in those outfits. The moderator that day was a man named Stephen Heller. I'd never met Stephen Heller before, one of the most prolific design critics, teachers, mentors, fairy godfathers in the world. And Steve was the moderator, and in a moment of aberrant courage, so this was, I don't know what I wanted to tell you yet. So after doing that, Joyce asked me if I wanted to write for Print Magazine. And I thought, of course I want to write for Print Magazine. And I've written for Print Magazine for every issue since then, for now 12 years. And 3 months ago became editorial and creative director of the magazine. All because I said yes to Rejections. This story is still going. So Steve, I meet Steve Heller, and in a moment of aberrant courage, and these are those moments that we all have when we think, I want to do this, but I'm too afraid to do it. Do it. He was nice to me for a moment, and I thought, he's being nice to me for a moment. I don't know if it's sincere or not, but I'm going to try to capitalize on this. And I asked him if, when we went back to New York, if he wanted to have lunch. And he said yes, and I followed through, and I asked him to have lunch with me. I was so nervous about having lunch with him, I wrote cue cards for myself in the form of a napkin, which I had on my lap because I was so worried that I wasn't going to have the wherewithal to have real conversation with him, that at least I'd have a cheat sheet that I could pick up, and it was something about baseball, his wife Louise, the conference, and I guess some interview he had done with Sackmeister. I told him I had 2 book ideas. I told him both book ideas. He looked at me without blinking an eye and said, not good, no good. They're not good ideas. Nobody would buy those kinds of books. I was like, okay. He's like, well, keep trying. You'll get a book under your belt, I promise. And then a few months later, I got a voicemail from a publisher who had called at Steve's recommendation. He had rejected a book idea that they had, didn't want to do it, but thought maybe I'd be the right type of writer for it. And that became How to Think Like a Great Graphic Designer with Michael Beirut's interview. So that all happened from that experience. I did a piece on Speak Up with Mark Kingsley that went a little bit viral. It was right around the time of the election. And the date here, I think, was for 2004 when George Bush said, "This is historic times." And we did a piece on all the incredible graphics that were coming out of the election, and it went viral. I'd never had anything go viral before. A friend of mine actually sent me the link and said, "Think you might like this?" And I'm like, "I wrote this." And then I got a cold call from a fledgling internet radio network that was interested in the possibility of my doing a show about design. And at the time, I remember thinking, I think I had like money signs in my eyes, like Bugs Bunny, and I was spinning around thinking that, oh my God, I'm going to be famous. And I later found out, when I got more details, that I actually had to pay them to do the radio show. I had to buy the airtime. But the concept was really, really interesting to me, and I thought it would be, just if nothing more, fun to talk to people about design. I didn't have a lot of well-known friends, but I had friends that had friends, and who knows, maybe I could ask people. And that's how I started Design Matters. I started Design Matters. John Fulbrook was my first guest. I was paying about $5,000 for 13 episodes, but I felt like, what else am I going to use my money for? I might as well use it for something that is interesting for me to maybe grow and learn. And since that time, I've done 250 episodes of Design Matters. So we then move to the next part of the story, which is another email from Steve Heller. This looks lascivious. It's not. Steve is very happily married to Louise. She's a good friend of mine. He sends emails like this. Steve asks me if I want to have lunch, and I do. And over lunch, he asks me if I'm interested at all in starting a master's program at the School of Visual Arts in branding. Had never been done before. There had never been a program like it. He told me not to answer immediately, to think about it. I waited a count of 1, 2, 3, and then said yes. And then we started that. And, time. How much time do I have left? 5 minutes. Okay, we're gonna go super fast through the rest of this. And it's actually almost over. You think that I'm like nearly done, right? Okay. And so I started that program. And then I get a letter from Emily Oberman. Emily Oberman is Michael Bierut's partner at Pentagram. She had worked at M & Company when the Y publication had come out, the annual report. I had watched her career my whole life. I thought she was a design goddess. She was one of my original design heroes. And I got an email from her. And the email was asking me if I wanted to be on the New York chapter of AIGA. And I was afraid to respond at first. I was afraid to respond because I thought maybe if I told her what my history had been with the organization, she'd change her mind and take back the invitation. But ultimately, I called her and told her that I would be delighted to, and I did. And then 2 years later, was asked to assume the presidency of all of AIGA. At which point, I decided, no, it's surreal. It's surreal. At which point I decided there would never, under my watch, if I could help it, ever be anyone that felt excluded by this organization. That we needed to accept all designers from all walks of life, from all the cities, all over the world, to be able to do something together, because we're a hell of a lot stronger when we're together than when we're fighting each other over who does better design and which discipline. Me and the boys. And then I started to visit all the chapters. I made it my business. My goal was I was going to visit all the chapters within AIGA. There was 60, at the time I was president, there were 62 chapters. Now I think there are 68. And I have visited all of the chapters in AIGA. And when I was doing that, I met the most incredible people. And so I ended up doing the first ever Phoenix Design Week. And I met a couple of guys that were starting this pop-up museum in Arizona, a pop-up museum. And then they were successful doing that, and they asked to have me do some work for them in Chicago, where they were doing another pop-up museum. And so for the first time in 20 years, I had my work back up out there again. And so, the moral of the story, I have 3 minutes left. If this hadn't happened, and this, 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 then none of these things would have happened. Not one of these things would have happened. On May 2nd, 2003, if you had told me that the worst moment in my professional career, in my life, would mean the beginning of an entirely new life, I would have thought you were crazy. But strange things sometimes happen if you don't give up. I wouldn't be here today. Your moments of feeling defeated, remember that. The longest way round is the shortest way home. Sometimes just have to take the long way. So if I hadn't done that, drawing Lee's potato chips, I'm still actually doing artwork about potato chips. And I'll leave you with two, oh my God, look at that titty. If you aren't getting rejected, I didn't do that, but I've been done it, it's defaulting. If you aren't getting rejected on a daily basis, then your goals aren't ambitious enough, and my favorite quote of all time, You could be the ripest, juiciest peach in the world, and there's still going to be someone who hates peaches. Thank you, thank you, thank you.